Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, we
Thank
got to
you
do
for joining us.
a
Uh,
digital sound check, and I think you might need to make it possible for me to share my screen. Is that right? Oh
Possibly.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
I
You
think
have,
we
you have.
can.
Okay.
Uh, and um, and so can I just I'll just briefly introduce Mark, who apart from being a very good friend is also the executive director of the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence at Berkeley, as well as head of strategic outreach at the University of Berkeley, the BEAR lab, the California Berkeley AI Research Lab. Mark studied AI at MIT and at Harvard, and has worked with some of the really greatest minds, some of the other really greatest minds in the industry. You've built technology startups. You worked at Bell Labs, at Microsoft, at Amazon, and currently you advise corporations and governments and international organizations on evolving benefits, risk, and governance of intelligent technologies. And the participants have all received the most recent paper. You have a very large production, but the most recent paper you did with John on AI governance, the BRIE report number 5 from this year. But there's more on the internet. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark. Thank you very much for your time. We are excited to meet you, and can you share from or do I need to do more? I'm just checking up here.
Share.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
And please continue to use the chat, everyone.
Okay. I'm going to set up my screen so I can watch the chat and see a few faces. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I am just a little bit concerned that that we're biting off more than we can chew, and so in my hour, I'm going to go quickly through what might be a very introductory, high points presentation, and leave a lot of time for discussion. And if I go too quickly, then we can go back. But I really think you've seen, most of you have seen most everything I'm going to tell you. But let me tell you first who I am, where I spend my time, and then I'll talk about what I think are the relevant topics here. I will be presenting my my most latest distilled view of AI. I think of AI as much more of an amplifier, a technology that is a tool that we can sometimes say that we collaborate with or we use to amplify. It is not a replacement for people, and I think that's a very important distinction from the way that it has been characterized. And then I'll talk about it just generally what it is, a little bit of technical background, and then what it looks like in finance, and then how it can be used responsibly. I noticed that I was being invoked during Vivek's discussion over and over as being the source of technical solutions to these problems. I will do my best to talk about where we are with respect to coming up with solutions, and I'll just give you my best. Before I before I give you the quick tour, I wanted to just observe that COVID, since last year I spoke at Soren's gathering, COVID has really changed things, and it's really been like a time machine. Many of the changes that we were predicting would be coming over the decades were adopted within weeks. I was in a a bank branch, and my first encounter was with a machine that greeted me, right? And I needed to check in with the machine, and these kinds of things. It's been incredible to see this living experiment, and to, fast forward. So I come from the Berkeley AI Research Lab, which I think is Earth's greatest public AI lab, with a full deck of 52 professors here, and a lot of them are aces. Um, and we are an unusual institution because we have one of the oldest and most advanced AI laboratories, in robotics and machine learning and so forth. But it's embedded in a public institution that is known for progressive thinking, great economists and legal theoreticians and philosophers and psychologists. So it's a very interesting place to be, and I think we do some great thinking about governance. So a little reminder: colloquial AI is generally meant when you're talking about it at a cocktail party as technology with human-like behavior, and mostly is thought of as replacing people task by task. It will drive cars, it will translate language, it will do medical diagnostics, and many more things. And that's the mental model. And it goes even further, that the aspiration for general AI is human cognition in machine form. It can do any kind of thinking that we could do, only better. And these are really, I think, exaggerations and misconceptions. So it started in the 1950s, and I think every article about AI begins with this, but I thought I should show you the picture of the people. And I'll give you a 2-minute review of machine learning, which is really the subfield of artificial intelligence, where the breakthroughs came a little over 10 years ago that really brought it back into the limelight. So machine learning comes in 3 flavors, more or less. Supervised learning, where you have examples and they're labeled. So this is a tumor that is malignant, and this is a tumor that's benign, right? And you have many examples, and they're labeled, right? And then the system learns to recognize those labels when given a new example image. Unsupervised learning, where you have a vast number of data points, and you extract clusters or find patterns in that data. And so, for example, people who bought these products also bought those products, right? Or that sort of behavioral data is often unsupervised. And then the third type of learning is reinforcement learning, and that is where a system maximizes a score of some sort. And it's very important in robotics these days, in finding the right behavior in situations. So, for example, even autonomous driving is a kind of robotics challenge. So here are some pictures that give you a sense for it. Supervised learning has data where each data has its own label, and you try to separate the groups. Unsupervised learning, the data is just all looks the same, but you find which is nearby, right? You find groups. And in the case of reinforcement learning, there's a kind of network that discovers, in the case of the most powerful reinforcement learning, using a deep network, is that it evolves a policy for the reward function for the score. And so, for example, it can learn to play a game that's a very sophisticated game because of the deep network. So this is just a quick highlight, and then there's a tendency in the press, because it sells magazines, to talk about how AI can do everything. And this is a fairly recent article in Forbes, and the way it anthropomorphizes, it illustrates how the media can really be confusing in its exaggeration. So it simply says that AI can read, and then it gives an example of a program that can summarize and find salient points in an article. And it can write, and see and hear and so forth. So I'm going to go through some examples of where the limitations are. You may have heard that you can now go shopping in certain stores, and you don't have to check out, because the stores have sensors and cameras, and they know what you've put in your bag, and you just walk out and it charges you, right? But the reality of it is, of course, that there's a very large number of people looking over your shoulder and checking those videos to make sure that that those automated recognition of what you put in your bag is correct, right? And then we heard for some time, I think it was targeted for 3 years ago, that trucks would no longer need drivers, right? But then 2017 came and went, and there's still a long way to go, right? We've completely outfitted our vehicles, and there are in many cars now all of these sensors generating a gigabyte per second of data, and all being processed by very powerful computers, but they still have a little difficulty with navigating with many moving vehicles, each one controlled by a human, right? And to get a sense for even the simplest setting in which the kinds of machine learning we're using simply do not scale. Here's a uniformed officer in a certain position, and supposing we train a system to recognize that we're looking at a uniformed officer, and the uniformed officer is in this position, that signals that you should stop and pull over. We're checking your ID. And then here's a uniformed officer in a rather similar position, but you probably shouldn't stop and pull over. And so this is a question of context, and context is one of the big areas that we have a long way to go. We need more breakthroughs. You may have heard about GPT-3, GPT-2, which was announced a year and a half ago, was a really big splash. It's something called a language model that can intelligently complete text. And what it's done is it's a system that's been fed and digested billions of words in structured language. So all of the text of many books, all of the Wikipedia, many articles in different fields, and so it's really quite sophisticated, but it has internalized the probabilities of strings of words. So what's phenomenal about it is that you can feed it the first couple of sentences of what seems like a spy novel, and then it will write out 2 or 3 pages of what looks like spy novel, right? And we'll get many of the things right. If a person lights a cigarette somewhere, then the person will very probably put the cigarette out 3 paragraphs later. And there are all kinds of things which, based on the probabilities of what is written in millions of publications, it can essentially complete what you're writing. But here you see a couple of examples where it just does something that doesn't make sense, but would make sense in terms of the probabilities. You're having a small dinner party. You want to serve dinner in the living room. The dining room table is wider than the doorway. So to get it into the living room, you will have to, and then the completion by GPT-3 says, remove the door. You have a table saw, so you cut the door in half and remove the top half. And of course, that wouldn't help you get the table through the door. It's just doesn't really make sense. And so there are many examples like this of it just revealing that although it can be extremely impressive, you don't know when it's going to give you nonsense. And so that means that it's not really a dependable system. It does have many, very powerful applications, though. So in some, the things that AI can do today depend on, this ability to take a vast amount of data and then find patterns. It can find the patterns in a sea of data and then identify a tumor or a likely fraudulent purchase. It can predict or infer taste from trillions of data points of behavior. It can play a game for the equivalent of 1 million hours and do that overnight because you can spread it over 10,000 computers. And then learn, internalize the probabilities to win that game. It can simulate looks and styles, so you can use the system to take a piece of writing, and then the system will rewrite it in the style of Mark Twain or in the style of the New Yorker, and it can, this can also be used to capture a person's voice and then use that voice to say something that they never said, and so forth. And then one of the things that has caused real harm is that it can, in maximizing engagement on social media, it can actually drive behavior in a very big way. But the limitations stop with some very basic things. In fact, the advanced systems can do very, very difficult things well, but the easy things are the ones that it can't do. So toddler physics, just understanding how the world works. If you put a toddler in a room and then you carry a big box and then you bump up against the door a couple of times, this 18-month-old child will walk over and open the door for you. And this is a famous experiment by Alison Gopnik, who's one of our psychologists. And the problem there is that the AI systems that are trained on data are not capturing causality, cause and effect, and then there's no sense of physics. There's no way for such a system to empathize, right? Because they're not grounded in the human condition. It's one of the great challenges is planning at multiple timescales, and just having a sense of context to tell the difference between something's a little bit odd to something as a real breakthrough. So these are just some examples of the limitations. So I will switch gears to talk about the applications in finance. the way AI is used in finance today, you can tell me what I'm missing here, but what I've been um, seeing in discussions with some of the big um, banks and insurance companies is that it's used for risk assessments. It's used to do a better job in the world of actuarial science and credit scoring. It's certainly given us a leap in our ability to detect fraud and to detect snooping and so forth. It's been used on Wall Street and investment management to generate alpha with mixed results. And as in most industries where there's sales and client service, it's used to make sales more effective and to improve client service by making the repetitive part of the client service is maybe handled by bots, and then that enables the humans to do the real judgment-oriented work. And so there's a real explosion of financial technologies and applications in these areas of insurance and credit scoring and fraud detection. My view is that causal reasoning will be the next breakthrough, and we may have it in a couple of years, or it may take decades. But when that is part of the technical landscape, then we'll have better understanding from reading, and that will allow us to have a more sophisticated customer service, automated customer service, and increased accuracy in, for example, judging people's risk tolerance and that sort of thing, and more effective, unfortunately, targeted advertising. We have enough precision propaganda as it is, but it's astonishingly effective. And assuring that it's trustworthy or virtuous, there are generally three views. One is that there are malicious uses. When we have a great amplifier, then it can be used to amplify malicious intent, and there's an arms race there. So if you're trying to steal credit cards and you have the help of an AI system, you can do a better job of stealing credit cards, right? Then there are the unintended effects that Vivek was discussing, bias and privacy issues, and then the social effects, which are also unintended, but they're much broader, like the effect on jobs. So I'll speak 1 minute on each. In the case of malicious uses of artificial intelligence in general, the tools have been used. The tools of automation have been used by adversaries for forever, but the cost is really dropping. AI is a very, very inexpensive way to create a mass of bots and then flood social networks and so forth. And this applies in finance as well. And if you can create what looks like a mass of people promoting a particular stock, you might move the market. And then there are new attacks that are possible only through AI that were not possible before. And to the degree that we depend on AI to keep our systems running, they can be exploited. And then there's a change in the character of threats. One of the things that that I think is a billboard of an example is the scale in which things are possible now. And so if for example we are trying to break in, if an adversary is trying to break into a system that's somewhat protected, they can send a million different variants of a phishing email to a million different people and see which one gets through. And that doing that used to be very expensive, and you had to have an entire KGB of 10,000 people working on it. And now one person or a small group of people can do the work of 10,000. So there's a lot on the horizon there. And then completely separately, there are the unintended effects of systems. So here's a cute cartoon of what happens with predictive models. If you train predictive models on input from your users, then it can leak information in unexpected ways. Here, the person has typed, "Long live the revolution, our next meeting will be at," and then the auto-completion from the system that was trained says the docs at midnight on June 28th, right? And so, this was not, of course, anticipated by Google when they built their auto-completion system, and it just requires this, again, the scale of it requires continuous vigilance. So systems meant to do one thing may do another entirely. As Vivek discussed, the amplified systems show the bias that may have already been inherent in the system, but now that we're automating and able to see, it could remain hidden in a way that AI has brought out, and so we're now imposing a certain standard of behavior on our systems that we perhaps didn't on our people. So that's a sort of a positive. There's a kind of digital fingerprint or footprint that is extremely fine-grained. If you look at all of your searches, it gives a profile of you that's finer grained than you could ever have compiled manually. And this is useful to influencers, and it really means that we are in peril of mercantile or political interests using that and manipulating in ways that it used to be a blunt instrument, and now it's a really fine-grained instrument. And then finally, there's cybersecurity. There's the first example was, I think, 3 years ago, where a CEO got a call from a chairman urging a wire transfer of $200,000 to a vendor, and he wired the money, and then later discovered that was someone who had used the system to create the sound of that voice of the chairman, and it wasn't actually him. And so there's a lot of opportunity for fraud that again, there's an app for that. It used to take quite a bit. So in assuring AI is trustworthy, I leave you with these thoughts, that I view it as an amplifier, not a replacement. We're not building a person in a box. One of the things that we have been seeing is a shift from AI governance essentially being entirely in the hands of industry to the governments and regulation. In finance in particular, there's a lot of sector-specific regulation that's evolving, but because of the speed of the evolution, the industry still has to take responsibility. So that was my high-speed overview, and I'd like to open it up for discussion, and I will pull the slides back up if we feel it's needed, but I'm not sure that that's as important as discussion. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
So sorry. Thank you very much, Mark. And so as you know, we will be working the next 6-8 months on basically a risk scan and looking at the challenges, very concrete challenges, and which dilemmas this raises. So just to get discussion started, I mean, you presented what AI can do and some of the limitations and some of the main risks in the area relating to malicious, unintended, and social use. In the financial sector, where do you see the biggest challenge? Not necessarily in effect, but as a challenge for the financial sector in managing this.
Well, if just using my conversations with the likes of Ping An, I think there are two areas in which most of my concerns would lie. One is in this sense of the trade-off between assuring privacy and fairness, and getting the resources to the people who deserve them. So the large financial organizations have a kind of dual responsibility, right? One is to be effective and provide service and for their clients, and the other is as a social entity, in a sense, implementing the social good, partly on behalf of the government. So, for example, applicants for loans, applicants for mortgages need to be treated fairly, and at the same time efficiently, and that's the trade-off there. So the information that is available, for example, to Google or Amazon about an applicant for a loan really enables them to assess the likelihood that the risk, in making a loan of various sizes to a particular individual. And unfortunately, this will lock people into a particular category. So if you're a high risk because you've done something in your younger, crazier days, or you were tangled up with the wrong people, it locks you into a bad category, right? And so this is the basic issue of I wouldn't call it bias, but being labeled, right, by an algorithm, and then having that label stick with you. And that I think that the challenge there is just as it is in healthcare. Um, the the responsibility of the actuary, which is to make an accurate assessment, but then to factor in a kind of intentional blindness to certain things, so that people can be given a second chance, right? And depending on the culture from which you come, that second chance is more or less important. But I believe, at least in the United States, it was part of what de Tocqueville noticed, was that each individual was able to reinvent herself, by moving to a new town and just giving it another try. And that was part of the real appeal of the American experiment. And I think that would then, one would want to capture that in the algorithms, but it's not at this point. So that's I think that's comes in the under the rubric of fairness, and the way that's the way that's implemented is really in the process of designing the algorithms, and then testing the algorithms. Right, it really needs to be throughout the organization. So I'd say fairness is a very important rubric, and then there's fairness, and then we also talk about cybersecurity as a really very, very high priority for the banks, not only in protecting the assets, but also protecting privacy, and protecting the individuals who are their customers from malicious parties.
I think so. There are numerous questions in the chat now. Perhaps Sairam, because I think actually Mateusz's question relates a little bit to yours as well. So, will there always be unintended consequences when we use AI in business? Do you want to elaborate, Sairam?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the presentation, Mark. It was very interesting. So you spoke about unintended consequences when we use AI. So I wanted to ask, because when we use AI in business applications, there are probably going to be unintended consequences, because there will be a lot of chain reactions when we start using those technologies. So I wanted to ask, can there be some systems better designed than others to be able to cope with those consequences that we may not initially be able to see, but as we see them, they may be more resilient. They may be more resilient to be able to handle those unforeseeable consequences.
I'm always one to think in examples, and the example that comes to mind is this drastic example of social networks turning your grandmother into a neo-fascist, right? Because the simple algorithm meant to keep people engaged feeds the news report that's more engaging. They're going to click, they're going to read. And it turns out that more engaging is a scandal, right? Rather than a thoughtful coverage of something, with subtleties. And the reaction was initially to deny any wrongdoing, saying, well, our job is just to present what people want, and it turns out that people want trash, right? And but over time, as it's driven extremes, and civil, civil discourse has really gone downhill. I think we're starting to see some reactions. What really was missing there was a sense of responsibility and a set of anticipated potential areas of difficulty, and then setting up a kind of observatory or a feedback loop where there are people who are responsible for watching things that might be going wrong, right? And it's not necessarily possible to build it into the system itself, but to create a system that includes human beings watching for anomalies, and then alerting, and then having that fed back into the system. So that's my best answer for now.
Mateusz, do you have a follow-up, or do you, Saran?
What Mateusz wrote in the chat is, do we have today a technology to teach AI the right context, and how would that process look? I can tell you that what we think of as context, it comes down to a focus on different different general areas. So when I am interviewing someone about the effectiveness of the technology in their healthcare center, I might ask a question, and then the response is just a little bit off. And what that signals to me is that they actually don't want to talk about this subject because it's a sensitive subject, right? And I might think, well, that's interesting. That's a sensitive subject. Let me try another one. And that kind of thinking, to put that into a system, into a dialogue system, really requires a set of a set of experiences, right? And capturing those experiences and potential motivations is a real challenge. So there are toy versions of context. For example, we have a system that we train to assemble furniture. We train the system to assemble IKEA furniture, and we've trained it on many examples of chairs, and then many examples of tables. And then when we give it a shelf, it learns very quickly to do a shelf, because it's got, from the context of chairs, certain probabilities, and from the context of tables, and it figures out the shelf more quickly. But the greater context of that I'm talking about requires the interactions with many human beings, and the kinds of things that motivate them and scare them and so forth. And that's going to be a while down the road.
Are you picking from the chat?
I was just looking at the chat, so please give me an idea of what you think makes sense.
Catherine, you asked about methods to remove possible biases in data for loan applications.
That came up in Vivek's talk, and it's a terrific idea. We don't need to really put that in the AI context. You could think about that in terms of people. We have people working in the criminal justice system. How would we remove bias in their work, right? And then what we've done is we've codified what they did by looking at every judgment made by the judges in a particular region, and put that all into a system. And now we have an automated sort of meta judge that does everything that those judges did over the last 50 years. And well, it looks like they have been quite biased in what they've done. So we have a system that's biased, right? So one proposal is simply to dictate that we would like to see a more equal distribution in the outcome. What that turns out to do, though, is somewhat arbitrary. It just reduces the number. Let's just say that it has been observed that there's a bias against people of color in a particular region, so they're sent to prison 3 times as much as whites. So we're going to just adjust the system so that it comes out 50-50, or it comes out in a pro rata manner. That doesn't actually get to the question of justice. That maybe that's considered proper representation, but what really one wants to do is to get fair treatment, fair assessment, and I think that we need a more sophisticated approach there, right, in criminal justice. In the case of trying to remove bias from a data set, one notices the pattern, but then one needs to go down a level in the data and examine the specific cases, and then find the sources of, dare I say, truth, or sources of the basis for a fair decision in each of the cases that look like they may have been biased, and then reprocess that data to create a less biased data set. So what you really want are still human generated data sets, but then adjusted. And that's a very manual process at this point. I think in finance, it would be similar. So you look at the fact that, let's just say, people of certain neighborhoods that are lower income neighborhoods are not being awarded mortgages as they should be, and then you have to look down beneath the numbers there, and either you just give them a head start and goose them all, or you find other means to judge that would give a result that's more desirable and more equitable.
Sasha, you raised the question of the right to be forgotten and the general right. So following up on the login argument, do you have a comment on that, Mark?
Well, the right to be forgotten is actually the law in Europe and in California, right? It is implemented as law. I'm not sure how much precedent there is. That is to say, someone who invoked it had their past eradicated, but then the past came back to haunt them because it was captured in other websites, and right. And so I don't know whether in practice, whether it's working in practice. But your question, should there be a right to be forgotten, I think is a real ethical, philosophical question. I personally believe that there should be, because because I believe people can change, right? And given the biases, right, and the importance of first impressions, I know people who have applied for a job and gotten quite far in their interviews, but then were rejected because someone stumbled across an old Facebook photo where they were misbehaving in college, right? And they lost that opportunity, and that's I think why it really is that our laws and our norms were built for a certain scale, and the new technology brings things to a new scale. It's not artificial intelligence, it's just the distribution of the internet, right? Even without any machine learning, putting a few pictures up on the internet means that they are available to the 7.5 billion people in the world, and that was not possible before the internet, and so we would share a photo by taking a physical photo and showing it to a friend, but if we didn't want it ever to be seen by anyone else, we could throw it away or burn it. And now when you send a text message to your friend, depending on what you believe about the the systems used by various governments, it may be stored forever. The fact that you had that thought and that feeling at that moment is captured and stored forever for future, retrieval, and that just changes the quality of life. And I think that one should have a right to an ephemeral experience that would disappear. I think that it just feels like a right, but it could vary from culture to culture.
May I follow up on that? Actually, I see how or where you're coming from with regards to this philosophical question or discussion. I totally agree with you. I also would argue for having it. So I'm a European, and I'm maybe more geared towards that. But I'm also wondering, coming from a business perspective, I think we could have something like an efficiency or effectiveness discussion, like depending on which momentum you take. Let's say nowadays I have my data and I want to make some kind of predictions as of now, then I guess I would want to keep my data. Whereas I want to do some kind of future analysis, let's say maybe in 5 years' time or so, the data that I have might be not accurate anymore, right? So then maybe also firms want to have something like some kind of idea of adjustability or agile approach to their validity of the data or so. And understand, so relating that to this forgetting in sense of like, maybe our data is only accurate for a certain amount of time, and maybe we should then try to kind of develop its understanding or its accurateness.
I think you're touching on several things. One is the changing nature and evolving nature of our norms, our social norms. And if we suppose we were able to capture every thought, that a particular group of people were having in a particular city in 1973, and that was a data set, and we used that to train all of our systems. That it would really have some strange effects, because it would be essentially capturing the norms of 1973 and applying them and forcing them on us, right, in 2020. So there's a need to view data in its context and apply it appropriately and extract from it that which we would desire, but exclude those things which we may wish to allow to evolve, insofar as they bring, they codify our norms, right? The way I view law in the context in which I work is as capturing and codifying norms at a given time. And we try to make them general so that they will be flexible enough to evolve over time. But we do need to change our laws or change our interpretations of the laws as our norms change. And I think that's the same with our code, especially if we're writing, if we're writing systems that are really hardwiring some of these turning data into rules.
Mm-hmm.
We have quite a few questions coming up, Mark, in the chat. There's one from Rosemary and one from Marcella that are slightly related, if you will agree, Rosemary and Marcella, on the ability of AI to sort of rectify situations. So Rosemary, you are asking if AI can be used to address poverty in relation to resource distribution. And though not entirely related, Marcella, you ask if AI can help against political corruption. So these sort of use cases of AI to rectify social or other general issues.
I work with the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society, and it's 20 years old. So we weren't talking about AI 20 years ago. We were just talking about automation and information technologies. But there was enough of a hope that one could apply automation and information technology to solve society's greatest problems, right? And I think my mental model is that these are tools, and when we use them in the right way, we put together a system where it gives us the ability to see things we couldn't otherwise see. You could feed a huge amount of data and notice a pattern we hadn't noticed before. And so to your question about corruption in government, we can use the system to see corruption where it might not have otherwise been visible. But given the corruption that I see as blatant corruption, we still have a challenge in solving that problem, even though we can use the system to help see it. And I'm not sure exactly how we would do that. So it's a good aspiration, and it is a powerful tool. I think one ethical challenge is that we have a sense that people should be allowed to express themselves in their own way, in free speech in many countries, but then there's a conflation of the right to express yourself to the right to express yourself with an algorithmic amplifier, which is using bots and artificial intelligence and so forth, and I think that is a confusion. You don't necessarily want to give every person or every entity the right to create a million bots and change people's minds so that they think like you want them to, right? And so we've sort of come into a new era where you have the right to express yourself. That means that you could write a letter to the editor, and thousands or even millions of people could read that if they wished. But it's very different if you have the means to create something that is a completely fictitious video that goes right to people's hearts and rouses the rabble, and then distribute it by sending it to a seeded group of friends who will pass it on to their friends, and it will go like wildfire. And as the saying goes, a lie will go halfway around the world before the truth has finished putting on its shoes. So I think that that goes a little bit of the ways to answering your question. With respect to distribution of wealth and solving poverty, that it strikes me again as a tool, like the census is a tool, and when when a government or a polity is organized with the intent of creating a safety net and redistributing wealth at least to a certain degree, then a tool like the census can really help, because you keep track of how many people there are and what they need, right? And it enables you to implement an intentional redistribution of wealth. But I don't know that it will be used to create that intent. That's the problem that we have, I think, in the United States now, is that the tools are being used to change the intent of the people, and that's influence, and the tools are very effective at influence, but they're not really appropriately governed.
Humans in the loop is not always the answer.
Well, right.
Martin, you have a question also on the thoughts of at Bear on opportunities for applying AI in finance within informal economies. Would you care to follow up on the question, Martin?
Sure, thanks, Soren. So the question is, in a country like Kenya, we have the largest telecom provider, Safaricom, who have access to the majority of the informal economy through smartphones or feature phones, and
Mm-hmm.
then most are on WhatsApp, Google, etc. Is there any interesting work you're doing in the lab? And this builds on the question I had earlier to Vivek, that can be applied to this informal part of the economy who might never ever get formalized, but for whom artificial intelligence represents an entirely new paradigm for operating, particularly issues of finance. So not necessarily formalizing, but having a layer of technology over informality. Thank you.
Can you help me out so that I can answer the question you're asking?
Sure.
What would an example be of informal access to AI for those who
So
wouldn't otherwise have access?
So I pick urban Nairobi, but maybe in a slum, or rural Kenya, maybe
Yeah.
Kisumu or Kiambu. You've got
Okay.
a lot of people trading using WhatsApp, all kinds of, it could be in food, it could be in clothes, etc.
I've read
But
about
nobody ever maps, there are no patterns that indicate maybe parts of Kisumu or parts of Kibera are viable markets or opportunities for trade exist. So that data never gets to those individuals, but it's sitting somewhere in a server in California, in Ireland, etc.
Right, but do they in those sparsely populated areas, do they have smartphones or phones with texting?
They do.
They do. So it's just that they're off the map right now.
Exactly.
I was speaking to a fellow named Sam Gichuru, who was working at the NILAB, and he had a group,
NILAB, yeah, I know.
Yeah, he had a couple of groups working on this 5 years ago, and I would think that if we're simply leaving it to a market economy, then we're waiting for people from those regions to show up and insist, right? Whereas if it came from, again, the will of the government, or the Kenyan government, or even regional people, then it could perhaps guarantee a broader distribution. But I do see it as it's a great opportunity. I mean, the kinds of things that they would do is they would trade animals or semi-finished goods, right, made from wool or whatever they're growing, and they would make it available on these essentially these bulletin boards, and they would set up the trades so that when they come to market, it's already sold, and they wouldn't have a wasted trip, because that's a long walk with your animals. And so I can see it as having great promise, but the implementation does feel to me like it needs a little bit of a push, and that may be either governmental or some kind of organized force, possibly a person who has been very successful and then wishes to implement that, even if it's not the government, and perhaps you.
We're running out of time. I think maybe if you have just a few minutes left, Mark, there are sort of one or two questions. I think Tapelo, you have a question also on emerging economies and the role of the state and the possibility to leverage AI as a tool. Would you care to frame the question, Tapelo?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. I think my question is more about the regulatory side, and you make the point that both government and industry share a responsibility for the regulation of responsible use of AI. But my view is that in many instances, there might be a stronger case, or a case for much more stronger involvement of government in the regulation, given that industry might have certain vested interests in status quo. And however, if such an argument is agreeable, the question then becomes, particularly in developing economies where state capacity is constrained, how do we create that capacity for the state to stay on top of the development of AI to be able to provide effective regulation?
I want to be humble here because this is, I am extremely good at technology, and I really know what I'm talking about in technology, but I am only an armchair economist, right? Everything I know about economics, I learned in the last 10 years, right? So it would seem to me that one approach would be to have the government impose certain requirements, or at least a certain fiscal responsibility on industry. And so on the one hand, it could be that there must be a certain duty to investigate or educate and keep abreast of the latest developments and impose that on industry. Another would be that if certain deleterious outcomes occur, that the platform companies responsible, is held responsible, financially responsible for some of the negative outcomes, and that would force them to keep track of these potential negative outcomes, and one would decide which kinds of industry would be responsible for which kinds of negative outcomes. So there's a beginning of an answer, but it's not backed by an actual level of understanding that I would wish for you to get a good answer. That's the technologist answer to your question.
We just so you're warned, we might get back, Mark, through our process, and so I think we are running out of time, and we're very grateful for you sharing all your time, Mark. It's really been interesting and extremely relevant for the work that we're about to launch. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. I mean, is there sort of one burning question out of this that I can see there are a few we didn't touch on explainability and on impact. In summing up, I mean, we will now over the next half year or so look at what are the challenges. We'll do a risk scan and look at what kinds of dilemmas this raises, and we've touched on quite a few of them now. And if we may, we will come back with some of our work in a few months' time, and maybe we can sort of pick up the discussion again. But really, a very, very big thank you for your time. And I know that there are at Berkeley and at Bear, and there are quite a few resources that you've posted online which will definitely be relevant for our work as we go forward.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me, and I will make myself available to the greatest extent possible to help with your ongoing discussions.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, thanks for caring about this extremely important topic.
It is, and thanks for all your good answers. Thanks.
All right, bye all.
And so thank you for all your good questions and for your comments. I think it really bodes well for our future work. So we as Mark gave a bit more of his time and Vivek too, we sort of we also took a little bit more time, and that leaves us with not so